The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, casting wavering heat mirages across the parched earth of Dustbone Gulch. In the center of what passed for the town square, little more than a patch of hardpan dirt surrounded by weathered wooden buildings, stood a thick cottonwood pole. Bound to it with rough hemp rope was a woman whose fiery red hair caught the desert light like flames against her pale, sunburned skin. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, casting wavering heat mirages across the parched earth of Dustbone Gulch. In the center of what passed for the town square, little more than a patch of hardpan dirt surrounded by weathered wooden buildings, stood a thick cottonwood pole. Bound to it with rough hemp rope was a woman whose fiery red hair caught the desert light like flames against her pale, sunburned skin. Bridget O'Malley had been tied there since dawn, and now the sun approached its cruel zenith. Her green dress, once the finest thing she owned, was torn and stained with dust and perspiration. Her lips were cracked, her throat parched, but her emerald eyes still blazed with defiance despite the desperate circumstances. The townspeople of Dustbone Gulch kept their distance, stealing glances from doorways and windows. Some whispered among themselves, their voices carrying doubt and unease. Others simply went about their business, afraid to question the word of Sheriff Marcus Kane, the man who had orchestrated this barbaric display. Kane himself sat in the shade of the saloon's porch, his silver star glinting against his black vest. He was a man of medium build but large presence, with cold blue eyes and a carefully waxed mustache. Every few minutes, he would glance toward his prisoner with satisfaction, as if admiring his handiwork. "Justice," he would mutter to anyone within earshot. Finally, justice for poor Thomas O'Malley. But the truth was far different from the tale Sheriff Kane had spun for the good people of Dustbone Gulch. 3 days earlier, Thomas O'Malley had been found dead in his small ranch house 5 miles outside of town. The Irish immigrant had arrived in the territory 2 years prior with his new bride, Bridget, seeking to start fresh after the troubles back east. They had built a modest but prosperous life, Thomas working as a farrier and blacksmith while Bridget tended a small garden and took in sewing to supplement their income. Their success, however, had not gone unnoticed by Sheriff Kane. The lawman had his eye on the O'Malley property, knowing it sat atop a natural spring that would be valuable to the railroad men who occasionally passed through town, scouting for potential routes and depot locations. He had made several offers to purchase the land, all of which Thomas had politely but firmly declined. "This land is our future," Thomas had told his wife after Kane's last visit. "We'll raise our children here, God willing, and make something of ourselves." But Thomas O'Malley would never see that future. On the night of his death, Sheriff Kane had arrived at the O'Malley ranch under the pretense of investigating reports of rustlers in the area. Thomas had welcomed him in, offering coffee and conversation by the firelight. What happened next was known only to 2 people, and one of them was now dead. According to Kane's account, delivered to the townspeople with practiced sincerity, he had discovered Thomas lying dead on his kitchen floor, apparently poisoned. Standing over the body, he claimed, was Bridget O'Malley, clutching a vial of rat poison. When confronted, she had allegedly confessed to murdering her husband for his insurance money and the deed to their property. The story was compelling in its simplicity, and the sheriff had evidence to support it. The vial, conveniently found in Bridget's possession, and a forged letter in her handwriting detailing a supposed affair with a traveling merchant. What the townspeople didn't know was that Kane had murdered Thomas in cold blood when the man continued to refuse his offers, then staged the scene to frame his widow. Bridget had been arrested immediately and held in the town's small jail cell. But Kane had no intention of waiting for a circuit judge to arrive. He had convinced the townspeople that the evidence was overwhelming and that swift justice was required. Some had objected, calling for a proper trial, but the sheriff's authority and persuasive tongue had won the day. "The woman's guilty as sin," he had declared at an impromptu town meeting. "We all know she never fit in here proper. Foreign ways, foreign blood. And now we see what comes of it. Poor Thomas trusted her, and look what it got him." The xenophobic undertones of his argument had found fertile ground among some of the townspeople, though many remained uncomfortable with the proceedings. Nevertheless, by morning, Bridget had been dragged from her cell and tied to the pole in the square, left to face the desert sun as her execution. Now, as the heat reached its most punishing intensity, even those who had supported Kane's harsh justice were beginning to have second thoughts. Mrs. Abernathy, the preacher's wife, clutched her prayer book and whispered concerns to her husband. "This isn't right, Samuel. A woman deserves a proper trial, even if she is guilty." But the Reverend Samuel Abernathy, a weak man who feared contradicting the sheriff, merely shook his head. "Sheriff Kane knows the law better than we do, Martha. We must trust in his judgment." At the general store, proprietor Henry Watts served customers with unusual quiet, his normally jovial demeanor replaced by a troubled frown. When young Billy Morrison asked why the lady was tied up in the square, Watts could only shake his head and turn away. The only person in town who seemed entirely untroubled by the proceedings was Kane himself, who continued to hold court on the saloon porch, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of Bridget's supposed crimes and his own heroic role in uncovering them. "Mark my words," he said, tipping back a glass of whiskey despite the early hour. "By sundown, justice will be served. The desert don't forgive, and neither should we." But justice was about to arrive in a form the corrupt sheriff had never anticipated. On the horizon, shimmering through the heat waves like a mirage, a lone figure approached on horseback. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than another desert phantom, but as the minutes passed, the rider grew more solid, more real. The man on the horse was tall and lean, weathered by sun and wind like the landscape itself. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his brown eyes held the steady gaze of one who had seen much of the world's cruelty and chosen to stand against it. He wore the simple clothes of a working cowboy, denim pants, a plain cotton shirt, and a well-worn leather vest. But there was something in his bearing, a quiet authority that spoke of experience and principle. His name was Jacob Thornton, though few people called him anything but Thorn. He had been many things in his 35 years: a soldier in the war between the states, a cattle driver, a town marshal in Kansas, and most recently, a wanderer seeking redemption for mistakes he preferred not to discuss. He had been riding through the territory, heading for California and what he hoped would be a fresh start, when he had spotted the smoke from Dustbone Gulch's chimneys. As he approached the town's outskirts, Thorne could see the gathering of people in the square and the figure tied to the pole. His jaw tightened as he recognized what was happening. He had seen vigilante justice before, had been part of it in his younger, more foolish days, and he knew how quickly a mob's sense of righteousness could become an excuse for cruelty. He guided his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Patience, through the town's main street, drawing curious and wary glances from the residents. When he reached the square, he dismounted and approached the pole where Bridget was bound. Up close, he could see the woman's dire condition. Her skin was burned red by the sun, her breathing shallow and rapid. But her eyes, those fierce green eyes, still held life and intelligence. When she looked at him, he saw not the desperate pleading he expected, but a fierce dignity that refused to be broken. "Water," she whispered through cracked lips, the first word she had spoken in hours. Thorne nodded and reached for his canteen, but before he could offer it to her, a harsh voice rang out from behind him. "Hold on there, stranger." Thorne turned to see Sheriff Kane approaching, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The lawman's cold blue eyes assessed the newcomer with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. "That woman is a convicted murderer," Kane continued, his voice carrying across the square. "She killed her husband in cold blood. This is justice being served." "Convicted by whom?" Thorne asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I don't see a courthouse in this town." "I am the law here," Kane replied, puffing out his chest. "The evidence against her was overwhelming. She confessed to the crime. The people of this town demanded justice, and that's what she's getting." Thorne looked around at the assembled townspeople, noting the uncomfortable expressions on many faces. These didn't look like people who had demanded anything. They looked like people who had been told what to think and were now having second thoughts. "What evidence?" Thorne asked. Kane's eyes narrowed. "That's none of your concern, Drifter. I suggest you water your horse and move along. There's nothing for you here." But Thorne made no move to leave. Instead, he walked closer to where Bridget was tied, studying her face and the fear in the crowd's eyes. Something about this situation felt wrong, deeply wrong. "What's your name?" he asked the woman softly. "Bridget O'Malley," she whispered, her Irish accent still detectable despite her parched throat. "And you killed your husband?" For a moment, fire flashed in her green eyes. I loved Thomas more than life itself, she said, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. I would have died for him. I did not kill him. She's lying, Kane interjected, stepping closer to Thorne with obvious menace. She confessed to the whole thing. Poisoned him for his money and property. Thorne stood and faced the sheriff directly. If she confessed, then you should have detailed records of that confession. You should also have physical evidence of the crime. Where are they? I don't have to prove anything to you, Kane snarled. I'm the sheriff, and I say she's guilty. That's all the proof anyone needs. Actually, said a new voice, I think we might need a little more than that. Everyone turned to see Doc Henley approaching from his office across the square. The elderly physician was one of the town's most respected citizens, a man who had served the community faithfully for 20 years. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the war, but his mind was still sharp and his moral compass true. I examined Thomas O'Malley's body, Doc Henley continued, ignoring the murderous look Kane was giving him. And I found some things that didn't quite add up with the sheriff's story. Now see here, Doc, Kane began, but the physician held up a hand. Thomas was supposedly poisoned, but I found no evidence of poison in his system. What I did find was a blow to the back of his head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. That's what killed him, not poison. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people stepped forward, their expressions shifting from uncomfortable compliance to open suspicion. You're mistaken, old man, Kane said, his hand moving closer to his gun. Your eyes aren't what they used to be. My eyes are fine, Doc Henley replied firmly. And so is my memory. I also remember that vial of rat poison you claim to have found on Mrs. O'Malley. Funny thing about that, I sold that exact same vial to you 3 weeks ago, Sheriff. Said you had problems with rats in the jail. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and Thorne could see the fear in Kane's eyes being replaced by desperation. A desperate man with a gun was the most dangerous kind. You're all fools, Kane snarled, drawing his pistol. This woman is guilty, and she's going to die as sentenced. Anyone who interferes will answer to me. But Thorne was already moving. Years of experience had taught him to read the signs of impending violence, and he was ready when Kane's hand went for his weapon. The drifter's own gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, the barrel leveled at the corrupt sheriff's chest before Kane could fully clear leather. I wouldn't, Thorne said quietly. For a moment, the two men stood frozen in their deadly tableau. Then Kane's nerve broke, and he slowly holstered his weapon, though his eyes promised this wasn't over. Cut her down, Thorne ordered, not taking his eyes off the sheriff. Several townspeople moved forward with knives, sawing through the ropes that bound Bridget to the pole. She collapsed as soon as she was freed, her legs too weak to support her weight. Mrs. Abernathy and 2 other women rushed forward to catch her, their earlier doubts now replaced by shame and concern. Get her water and get her into the shade, Doc Henley instructed. She's badly dehydrated and sunburned, but she'll live. As the women helped Bridget away from the pole, Thorne kept his weapon trained on Sheriff Kane. Now then, he said conversationally, why don't you tell us what really happened to Thomas O'Malley? I don't have to tell you anything, Kane replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Actually you do, said Mayor Hutchins, a portly man who rarely asserted himself but was clearly disturbed by the day's revelations. As mayor of this town, I'm suspending you from duty pending a full investigation. Deputy Williams, please take Sheriff Kane into custody. But Deputy Williams, a young man who had always looked up to Kane, seemed paralyzed by the rapidly changing situation. He looked back and forth between the mayor and the sheriff, clearly torn between loyalty and duty. Deputy, Thorne said firmly, your first duty is to the law, not to any individual man. Do what's right. After a moment that seemed to last forever, Deputy Williams stepped forward and extended his hand toward Kane's gun. I'm sorry, Marcus, he said quietly, but I need your weapon and your badge. Kane's face twisted with rage and defeat. You're all making a mistake, he spat. Without me, this town will fall apart. You need me. What we needed was honest law enforcement, Mayor Hutchins replied. What we got was a murderer with a badge. As Deputy Williams took Kane into custody, Doc Henley approached Thorne. "Thank you, young man. I'm ashamed to say most of us suspected something wasn't right, but we were too afraid to speak up." "Fear's a powerful thing," Thorne replied, holstering his gun. "It makes good people do bad things, and it lets bad men get away with worse. The important thing is you found your courage when it mattered." Over the next few hours, the full extent of Kane's corruption began to emerge. A search of his office revealed forged documents, including the fake confession he had attributed to Bridget. More disturbing was the discovery of correspondence with railroad representatives, detailing plans to acquire the O'Malley property for a future depot. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the town's boarding house, came forward with information that Kane had been pressuring several property owners to sell their land at below-market prices. Those who refused, she said, had found themselves facing trumped-up legal troubles or mysterious accidents. Thomas wasn't the first, she told the gathering crowd. But he was the first to be murdered outright. Kane was getting bolder, more desperate. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, Bridget O'Malley sat in Doc Henley's office, sipping water and allowing the elderly physician to treat her burns. The women of the town had brought her clean clothes and offered their apologies, though she bore them no ill will. "They were afraid," she told Mrs. Abernathy. "Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I understand that." When Thorne knocked on the doctor's door, Bridget looked up to see her rescuer framed in the doorway. He had cleaned up since the afternoon's confrontation, but his eyes still held that watchful quality that spoke of a man accustomed to trouble. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Alive," she replied simply. "Thanks to you. You would have found a way," Thorne said. "I could see it in your eyes. You weren't ready to give up." Bridget studied his face for a long moment. "You've seen trouble before," she observed. "More than most men." Thorne nodded. "More than I care to remember. But sometimes trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not." "And sometimes," Bridget said softly, "trouble brings unexpected blessings." Doc Henley cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. O'Malley needs rest," he said. "But she should be fine in a day or two. The burns aren't too severe, and she's stronger than she looks." "What will you do now?" Thorne asked Bridget. "Will you stay in Dustbone Gulch?" Bridget looked out the window toward the desert, where the last light was fading from the sky. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Thomas and we had dreams for this place. But those dreams died with him. I'm not sure I can stay here with all the memories." "The land is yours by right," Thorne pointed out. "And from what I hear, it's valuable land. You could sell it, start over somewhere else." "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "I could do that. But first, I need to see justice done properly. Kane needs to answer for what he did to Thomas, and to this town." Over the following days, as Bridget recovered and the town struggled to come to terms with what had happened, Thorne found himself reluctant to leave. He told himself it was concern for Bridget's safety. Kane still had allies in the territory who might seek revenge, but the truth was more complicated. There was something about the red-haired widow that intrigued him. She had faced death with dignity and emerged from tragedy with her spirit intact. She was intelligent, brave, and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded him of the better angels of human nature he had almost forgotten existed. For her part, Bridget found herself grateful for Thorne's presence. He was unlike any man she had known, quiet where Thomas had been gregarious, watchful where her husband had been trusting. But there was a fundamental decency about him that she recognized and appreciated. "You don't have to stay," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house where she was temporarily residing. "I know you were heading somewhere else when you found me." "California can wait," Thorne replied. "Besides, I want to make sure the circuit judge gives Kane what's coming to him." The judge, when he finally arrived 2 weeks later, was a stern, fair-minded man named Augustus Blackwood. He listened to the testimony, examined the evidence, and pronounced himself appalled by what he found. "Sheriff Kane," he declared from behind the makeshift bench set up in the saloon, "you are guilty of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, corruption of office, and perjury. I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead, sentence to be carried out at dawn tomorrow." Kane's trial had drawn people from miles around, and the saloon was packed with spectators. When the judge pronounced sentence, there was no celebration, only a grim satisfaction that justice had finally been served. That night, as the town prepared for the execution, Thorne found Bridget sitting alone in the cemetery beside her husband's grave. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, and she looked like a ghost herself in her white dress. "Are you all right?" he asked, settling down beside her on the ground. "I should feel satisfied," she said. "Justice for Thomas, punishment for his killer. But all I feel is empty. Kane's death won't bring my husband back." "No," Thorne agreed. "But it might prevent him from hurting someone else. Sometimes that has to be enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Finally, Bridget spoke again. "I've decided to sell the ranch," she said. "I can't stay here. Too many memories, good and bad." "Where will you go?" "I was thinking about California," she said, glancing at him sideways. "I hear it's a good place for people looking to start over." Thorne felt his heart skip a beat. "It is," he said carefully. "Though it helps to have someone to start over with." Bridget turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Are you asking me to travel with you, Jacob Thornton?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and he liked the way it sounded in her Irish accent. "I'm asking if you'd consider it," he said. "I know it's too soon, and I know you need time to grieve. But when you're ready, well, I'd be honored to have your company on the trail." "And after the trail?" she asked. "What then?" "I don't know," Thorne admitted. "I'm not a man who makes plans very far ahead. But I'd like the chance to find out, if you're willing." Bridget reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thomas would want me to be happy," she said softly. "He was that kind of man. And I think he would approve of you." "I hope so," Thorne said. "I'd like to have been the kind of man he could call friend." "You are," Bridget said with certainty. "You're exactly that kind of man." At dawn, Sheriff Marcus Kane was executed for his crimes, bringing an end to one chapter of Dustbone Gulch's history. But for Jacob Thornton and Bridget O'Malley, it marked the beginning of something new. They left town 3 days later, after Bridget had sold the ranch to a fair-minded cattle rancher who promised to honor Thomas's memory by treating the land well. The sale had brought her enough money to start fresh wherever she chose to go. As they rode out of Dustbone Gulch together, Bridget on a gentle mare she had purchased and Thorne on his faithful Patience, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Behind them, the town was waking up to a new day, free from the corruption that had poisoned it. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did?" Bridget asked as they crested a hill and looked back at the town one last time. "I try not to think about it," Thorne replied. "Some things are too terrible to contemplate." "I think about it sometimes," she said. "And I wonder if maybe Thomas sent you to me. If maybe this was all part of some larger plan." "Maybe," Thorne said. "Or maybe it was just luck. Good luck for me, bad luck for Kane." Bridget smiled, the first truly happy expression Thorne had seen on her face since they met. "I prefer to think it was fate," she said. "Thomas always said everything happens for a reason, even the bad things. Maybe the reason for all this pain was so that we would find each other." "That's a nice thought," Thorne said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He had seen too much senseless tragedy in his life to believe everything happened for a reason. But he was willing to consider the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, good could come from evil, and hope could be born from despair. As they rode toward the horizon, leaving the past behind and facing an uncertain but promising future together, the desert wind carried the sound of their horses' hooves like a song of redemption. In a land that was often harsh and unforgiving, they had found something rare and precious, a second chance at happiness. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist and revealing the vast expanse of territory that lay ahead of them. There would be challenges on the road to California, dangers and hardships that would test their resolve and their growing affection for each other. But they would face those challenges together, Two souls who had found each other in the crucible of injustice and emerged stronger for the experience. Behind them, Dustbone Gulch settled into its daily routine, forever changed by the events of the past few weeks. Deputy Williams had been appointed the new sheriff, and under his honest leadership, the town began to heal from the wounds inflicted by corruption and fear. The story of the red-haired widow and the drifter who saved her became part of local legend, told and retold in the saloon on quiet evenings. But for Jacob Thornton and Bridget O'Malley, the story was just beginning. As they rode west toward new horizons, the morning sun at their backs and the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them like an endless trail, they carried with them the most precious cargo of all, hope for a better future, built on the foundation of justice served and love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The desert that had nearly claimed Bridget's life now blessed their journey with its stark beauty and infinite possibilities. In a land where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers and the courage to do what was right, they had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple choice: to help someone in need, to stand up for justice, and to believe that even in the darkest of times, redemption is possible for those brave enough to seek it. Their horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, carrying them toward whatever destiny awaited them in the golden state of California, where the past could be forgotten and the future written anew by those willing to seize it.